Today's case is one of the saddest and most horrifying ones yet. The terrifying acts that the victims had to endure, especially during a time that was supposed to be fun and relaxing, is what makes it so much worse. What makes it even more heartbreaking is that one victim was left behind to live with this tragedy forever. Hi guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Zara, and on this channel, we talk about true crime. So if you're interested, please join the fam and hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button too, it really helps out my channel. And also share the video if you like. Let's get into it. We are talking about the Rogers family today, and Hal Rogers met his wife Joan during high school, where he was the loner kid, the quiet kid, the one who worked hard, as opposed to hanging out with his friends all day. And she was the popular, outgoing girl. Despite their differences, they were known to be a good match. Joan would bring Hal out of his shell, make him dance to country music with her, laugh and smile. In 1971, soon after high school, Joan and Hal got married, and Joan was also pregnant with their first child. They took over his parents' farm and began working as dairy farmers, and it was a huge farm, 200 acres, which is almost the size of a small suburb here in Australia. They lived in Wilshire, Ohio, which was a small town, less than 700 people, most of which were factory workers, farmers, or ran small businesses. It wasn't a very busy town. Apart from outdoor activities like hiking, fishing, camping, there wasn't a whole lot to do. However, everyone knew each other and looked out for each other. Their first daughter, Michelle, was born on February 22nd, 1972, and a couple years later, their second daughter, Christy, was born on October 6th, 1974. And since the girls were born and raised on a farm, they grew up loving animals and they were close, but they were very different. Michelle was the tomboy. She was shy and reserved. She had a group of her close friends and would rebel by smoking and drinking beer, whereas Christy was the popular girl. She was the cheerleader, she had lots of friends, and she was a daddy's girl. Hal and Joan never came from money, and owning such a huge farm didn't come without its challenges. They were extremely hard workers and worked day and night on their farm. The girls also helped their parents on the farm. They were paid to milk the cows every morning, and Joan also had to get a second job because the farm wasn't enough. It wasn't paying enough. So she ended up working some nights at her second job at a distribution center for beauty products. I mean, that is hard work. Joan apparently hardly slept. Working two jobs is hard enough, with one job being, a 24/7 job basically. But she also had to be a mom to two girls. She had to wake up early each morning, help Hal on the farm milking the cows, then give her girls breakfast, help them with anything they needed, then get the girls off to school. This was truly a family that worked hard every single day. I mean, just picture, right, for a second, waking up hours before sunrise on a cold winter morning, forcing yourself out of your warm bed to go out in the dark, freezing weather, and begin, assembling machines to milk cows. Imagine the mental strength it takes to then do it when you're only teenagers like Michelle and Christy. At this point, Hal and Joan were both only 36 years old, but the years of hard work took its toll on them both. Joan had become very thin. The lack of sleep began showing on her face, making her look a little bit older than she was. However, despite their struggles, the family was truly happy, and Joan and Hal made sure to spend time together whenever possible. They often went to breakfast together and went on date nights together, making sure to keep that connection alive. They did have some help, as Hal's younger brother, John, he was an ex-Marine and he also lived on the farm. However, he lived in a trailer off to the side, and he helped Hal on the farm. And John was known to the locals as they thought him to be quite odd, as he wore his army uniform in the town and talked about how many missions he went on with the CIA and Secret Service. But despite him being odd, no one knew how sinister he really was. Behind closed doors, he had been assaulting his own niece, Michelle, since she was just 14 years old, taking her into his trailer, making her endure unspeakable late night horrors, stripping her clothes off, blindfolding her, and her. To make matters worse, he recorded the entire assault over and over again. John would take advantage of Michelle whenever Joan and Hal were away on business, and he threatened her that if she told anyone, he was going to kill her. In the year 1988, John had been living with his ex-girlfriend, and they had recently broken up, but she continued living with him because she was looking for a place of her own. So one evening, the ex-girlfriend, she enters the trailer where she lives with John, and as she entered, she was suddenly attacked by a man wearing a mask. The stranger restrained her, he blindfolded her, he threatened her with a knife, not to make any noise, and he then raped her. But he recorded the entire thing. But during the attack, the ex-girlfriend was like, I recognize this voice. It was her own ex-boyfriend, John. Now, clearly, John had a thing about attacking women in this way. Once John released her, the ex-girlfriend immediately went to the police and reported the entire attack. After getting a search warrant, the police entered John's trailer and found a slew of evidence in his briefcase, videos of him his own girlfriend, as well as photos of another victim. Photos of a young girl seen nude with a blindfold on, and audio tapes were then found of the same girl begging and pleading for her life, begging her uncle to stop raping her. It was Michelle. John Rogers was arrested and charged with 7 counts of 3 against Michelle. And when the charges were first filed in March of 1988, Hal, Michelle's father, paid the bail and brought John back to the farm. It's believed that the girls and the town never really forgave Hal for this, although it's also believed that Hal didn't really know the full truth. When Joan and Hal found out what John did to their daughter, they were deeply upset, you can imagine horrified, and knowing this was all happening right under their noses would have been devastating. Michelle was now 16. She had suffered for 2 years. Hal later gave a statement saying, "If I'd known, I'd have killed the son of a bitch to start with." Meanwhile, John claimed the whole thing was a lie and he had never raped either of them. He was being set up. No one believed him, of course, except his own mother. Their mother, Irene, believed that, John was being set up and Michelle had lied about the entire abuse happening for the last 2 years. Even though there was clear evidence found, she refused to believe her son was guilty of a crime like this, which eventually led to Hal just cutting his own mother out of his life. John pled not guilty by reason of insanity, and sadly, 6 out of the 7 charges were dropped, including all of the charges relating to Michelle's abuse. And this was because she didn't want to testify in court. She didn't want to relive her attack, spend time describing the acts to strangers in court and going in and out of courtrooms and dealing with lawyers, She wanted to just be a normal kid, a teenager, go to school, hang with friends, and spend time with her boyfriend. John Rogers never admitted guilt, but was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. So that's a pretty wide range, but I couldn't find exactly how much time he ended up serving. At this point, the family had just been through so much in just a few months. Despite them minding their own business, working on their own lives, Uncle John came in and destroyed so much of their peace. Michelle could barely even talk about what she had endured all those years. So after a few months, they decided, fuck it, we need a break. It was decided that the girls would go on a vacation together, their first real vacation. And Hal opted out as someone needed to stay back on the farm. The work never ends on a farm. And also, their budget for this trip wasn't really huge. So the girls decided Florida would be the place for their dream vacation. At this point, Michelle was around 17 years old and Christy was like 14, 15. And they were old enough for Joan to travel with them and actually enjoy their company. The 3 women were so excited to be spending some much needed time together. They began planning their trip weeks in advance. And it would also take Michelle away from the drama, give her some breathing room, and a chance to just have fun. On May 26, 1989, the girls set off for their dream vacation. Their plan was to head over to Florida by car, which was a 1,000-mile or 1,600-kilometer journey. And this was due to it being obviously cheaper as their budget was quite tight. So they planned to visit as many attractions as possible, like Disney World, SeaWorld, and Silver Springs. They took many pictures on their Nikon One Touch camera and then headed west for the beaches of Central Florida. So the first part of the drive was around 8 hours until they arrived in Georgia. So they spent the night in a motel there and then woke up early the next morning to make the rest of the way to Florida. Once they got to Florida, they planned on going to the Jacksonville Zoo. And then the next few days were pretty much spent driving and sightseeing all day, spending the night in motels, and then starting all over again the next day. 3 days into the trip, on Monday, May 29th, Hal received a postcard from Joan jokingly complaining about how the girls were just dragging her everywhere. She probably planned on a much more relaxing vacation than the girls intended. They took a glass bottom boat tour in Silver Springs, and this might have been the first time Christy ever stepped foot on a boat. Neither Michelle or Christy could swim well. They were pretty scared of the water, and Joan couldn't swim at all. And all three girls were scared of being in water over their heads, and Joan was terrified of her face being covered by anything, especially water. They left Disney World early on Thursday, June 1st, and they headed to Tampa, where they planned to check into their motel called the Days Inn Rocky Point. And then over here, they wanted to check out the beaches and one more theme park. This would be their last stop before heading back home to Ohio. Along the way, Joan got lost. So she drove around for a while looking for their motel, but then she decided, let's just pull over and look at the map. As she's doing this, a man then approached their car and asked if they were okay, were they lost? He saw their car had Ohio plates and assumed that they needed a little help. He goes on to tell them that he's also from Ohio, and they had a little small talk before Joan asked for directions to the Days Inn Rocky Point. He wrote the directions down on Joan's map, which was on a Clearwater Beach brochure. Before he left, he asked the ladies if they didn't have any plans, later that evening. They were more than free to come out onto his boat and watch the sunset. The girls seemed excited, the man seemed nice and helpful, and a free ride on a boat, why not? So Joan then wrote down the directions to the boat ramp where they would meet him. It wasn't far away. And the stranger also told them to look out for a blue and white boat, which was his boat. Excitedly, the women thanked him and then made their way to their motel. I feel like we would never do this nowadays. Like, would anyone do this? Because you're asking someone for directions to your motel, but then that means that this stranger now knows where you're staying, right? So I feel like we would never probably do that anymore. But back then, it was a different life. Once they arrived at their motel, once the women finally arrived at their motel, it was around 12:30 p.m. They settled in, and Michelle, she called her boyfriend back home in Ohio, while Joan called the Busch Gardens theme park to check out the prices. And it's not known how they spent the rest of their day. Maybe they finally, relaxed on the beach. They then had dinner at a restaurant next to the motel, and then they left at around 7:30 p.m. As late evening settled in, they went back to their motel room. They changed into bathing suits, and this photo was taken of Michelle before they left. She's wearing her bikini and white shorts. And another photo was taken of their view of Tampa Bay from their room balcony. Soon they left in their car, a light blue Oldsmobile Calais, headed to the boat ramp, excited for a night out on the water. June 3rd was the day that Hal expected his girls to be back home, but June 3rd came and went. And while Hal definitely noticed their absence, he was not one to panic. He rarely showed his emotions and was very composed. So he just assumed that Joan and the girls decided to check out a few more places and they would be home in a few days. But when the next few days came and went, without a word from Joan or the girls, no phone call, no postcard, Hal did worry, and he reported them missing to the police. At first, the police believed that the women were completely fine. They were okay. Maybe they didn't, want to return to the memories the farm held in the recent months. They would be home, soon when they figured out what they were doing. But a few days later, that view would change. The next day, on June 4th, 1989, a group of tourists were on a sailboat. They were enjoying, their sunny day on the calm, beautiful waters of Tampa Bay. And the sailboat began crossing under the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. This in itself was a tourist attraction, as it's a pair of two long beams with tall cables in a triangular shape. And the bridge is considered the flagship bridge of Florida and serves as a gateway to Tampa Bay. So as the sailboat of tourists begins crossing under this iconic bridge, a few of the tourists saw something bobbing up and down in the water. Given they're on a boat sightseeing, they leaned in trying to see, what this animal could be. But their excitement was brief, as the closer they got to this thing, the thing turned out to be a body. With their shock and horror, the sailboat officials contacted the Coast Guard, who quickly sent over a rescue boat to come and recover the body. However, it wasn't that simple. As they tried to retrieve the body, something was weighing it down. A rope was tied to the victim's neck, and it was attached to a 30-pound or 13-kilo slab of concrete in an attempt to keep the victim underwater. Not long after this body was retrieved, more calls came into the Coast Guard. 2 more bodies were found. One was found over 2 miles or 3 kilometers away, and the third was found just under 200 meters away from the first body under the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. The second and third bodies were found with the same rope tied around their necks and weighed down with the same 30-pound or 13-kilo concrete slab. All 3 victims were nude. From the waist down, were found floating face down, and along with the rope around their necks, they had their feet bound together and their hands bound behind their backs, all with the same yellow rope. Apart from the obvious fact that the victims were white females, no one knew who they were. The investigation began immediately, but where did they start? No IDs were found on the bodies, no one in the area recognized them or even reported them missing, and then the coroner determined that they had been in the water for 3 to 5 days. A long time for no one to come looking for them in Tampa. It was determined that these had to have been tourists and not locals. The local media began picking up the horrifying story, and it now was circulating all around Tampa. Meanwhile, back at the farm, Hal began to think that his family left him. It's alleged that he did side with his molester brother for a moment, so perhaps the girls were mad and wanted to make it, a point that what he did was wrong. And it was also alleged that Joan had cheated on Hal in the past too. So the police had their eyes on Hal, although it was only briefly. Hal was known to go to lunches and dinners in town, so there was no way he could, make it to Florida and back without anyone in the town noticing that he was gone. By June 8th, a week after Joan, Michelle, and Christy checked into the Days Inn motel, a maid finally entered their motel room, number 251. The maid had come to the same room a few days prior when she first cleaned it, and during that first clean, she, moved their luggage, she put it up on the furniture, she moved some furniture around, she made the beds, she changed the towels, she tidied up, she cleaned the entire room. But now, almost a week later, the room looked exactly the same. Exactly the same as she left it. Nothing had changed. The beds were untouched, the furniture was the same, the towels were unused. She quickly alerted her manager. She found this really odd. The manager also found this odd and remembered the mother and 2 daughters who had checked in a few days earlier. And then he remembered the story on the news. reports of 3 female bodies found in Tampa Bay. He contacted the police immediately. The police arrived and they searched room 251. They were notified the room was registered to Joan Rogers and her 2 daughters, Michelle and Christy, and they were on vacation from Wilshire, Ohio. In their room, they found their suitcases still open, gifts and trinkets they bought along the journey, placed on various surfaces throughout the room, and then they found their camera. Police took the roll of film and had it developed, which revealed the various photos from their, vacation, and it also showed the last photos taken of Michelle and the view of Tampa Bay from their room balcony. The manager informed the police that the women checked in on June 1st, but after that, no one had seen them. The police then were notified that Hal had reported them missing to the Ohio police. A couple then phoned in with a tip that they had seen Joan's car, the 1984 blue Oldsmobile Calais with Ohio license plates, at a boat ramp a mile away, and she saw this car there on June 1st. Sadly, the dots were connected and the Florida police contacted Hal back at the farm to request all 3 women's dental records to ID the bodies found in the bay. Fingerprints found in the room were matched to the bodies, and final confirmation of their identities came from the dental records provided by Hal. The victims in the bay were Joan, Michelle, and Christy.
In 1989, Joan Rogers took her 2 daughters to Disney World. Christy and Michelle were 14 and 17, respectively. On the way back to Wilshire, Ohio, the 3 disappeared. They were found stripped from the waist down in Tampa Bay, bound and tied to concrete blocks.
Central Florida's most intense and most frustrating manhunt was on. When they searched Joan's car, they found the brochure for Clearwater Beach, your destination island. And on this brochure were 2 notes written by 2 people. One was in Joan's handwriting, and the other belonged to the stranger who gave directions to the motel and offered them this free sunset boat ride. Joan wrote, "Turn right, W on 60, 2.5 miles on right side, alt before bridge, blue with white." The stranger wrote, "Days in, right 60, Courtney Causeway," and drew a line from I-275 to the motel. This evidence was vital in finding out what happened to Joan, Michelle, and Christy. The directions written by Joan were to a boat ramp, and blue with white were probably the description of a boat that would be painted blue and white. The fact that the bodies were found in the middle of the bay, it was theorized that whoever took them on the boat would be the killer, the same person who gave them directions to their motel. Sadly, for the next 3 years, the handwriting sample and a partial palm print that was found on the brochure was the only concrete evidence that could link the stranger to the murders. The autopsies conducted on the 3 women would reveal how brutal their murders were. All women were found floating face down with their mouths gagged with silver duct tape covering it, their feet and arms bound behind their back with yellow nylon rope and weighted with concrete slabs around their necks. Although Michelle fought hard and she managed to free one arm before drowning. Water was found in their lungs, which indicated that they were forced into the water while alive and drowned. But I believe the cause of death was listed officially as asphyxia. There were no other signs of trauma, so it suggested that their killer had used the threat of force rather than actual force to control them. They were also nude from the waist down, which indicates sexual assault was very probable, but their bodies were so decomposed that the medical examiner could not even determine if they were sexually assaulted. There were no fibers, there were no fingerprints, no DNA. The bodies were essentially washed clean. The water in the bay is quite warm and the body is decomposed way faster than if they would have been in colder water. The decomposition process created gases which caused them to float to the water's surface, pulling the concrete blocks up with them. The concrete blocks the killer hoped to keep them under. Investigators stated that the tides in Tampa Bay form this regular pattern, but despite this, they could not determine exactly where the women had been tossed in the water, but they were sure that it was not from the land or from the bridge above. It had to have been from a boat in the middle of the water. Hal was devastated. He lost his entire family. Joan, Michelle, and Christy were buried in Wilshire, Ohio on June 13th, 1989 at Zion Lutheran Cemetery. Their small community was in disbelief that this happened, that 3 women from the town who simply wanted to go on vacation suffered at the hands of a monster. 300 family members and friends came to their funeral and to comfort and support Hal. He was now alone. All his girls were taken from him. 5 months after the murders, the case was still stagnant. There were no new developments and time was ticking. The lead detective in the case was Jim Capel, and one day he was going through a police bulletin and he saw that in May 1989, a very similar case was reported. And that story went as follows. So 2 Canadian women were on vacation in Madeira Beach, Florida. It was a 24-year-old blonde social worker named Judy Blair and her friend Barbara Mottram. On 14th May 1989, a man named Dave Posner approached them at a convenience store and offered to take them for a boat ride the next day. Now, in this area of Florida, it's super common to go out on a boat and be on the bay. Lots of tourists get offers to go out on boats, usually for a price, but back then it wasn't super uncommon for free offers of boat rides, along the beach. Dave was a middle-aged guy with a pot belly and he was very tan, so he was obviously always out on his boat. So the next day, on May 15th, Judy agreed to go out on Dave's boat, but Barbara refused. So Dave and Judy, they went out for a few hours during the morning, although Judy noticed that Dave seemed quite moody about Barbara not wanting to join them. So then later that evening, Dave offers them an after-dinner boat ride. And again, only Judy chose to go, which left Dave once again. He was annoyed and he was moody at the fact that both girls wouldn't join him. He tried to persuade Barbara to join, telling them, to bring their cameras. The view would be stunning at night. But Barbara once again declined. She didn't want to go. That decision probably saved both their lives. So Judy and Dave, they set off into the evening and several miles offshore into the Gulf of Mexico. They took pictures together and they enjoyed the meal that Judy had packed for them. Soon, Dave began making a move on Judy. He pushed himself on her, he was hugging her, and he was groping her. When she tried to get him to stop, he pointed to a roll of gray duct tape and threatened to tape her mouth shut. He said, "What are you gonna do? Jump out of the boat? Is sex worth losing your life over?" Judy was now terrified, begging him not to because she was a virgin. But this only got Dave extremely excited. He then violently raped her, and next he gave her some water to wash herself, probably wash his DNA off her. He then threw the roll of film from her camera into the water, and then he tried to clean his prints off her camera. He then began pacing up and down the boat, talking to himself, and he threw up several times over the side of the boat. Was this a sign of guilt? Did he let her live because Barbara could identify him? Could he later claim that all of this was consensual? But despite this, on their way back to shore, he talked to her normally, like nothing happened. Like, what do you mean? What happened on the boat? Nothing. We're just hanging out. As they got close to the shore, he then tells her to get off the boat and swim the rest of the way. So she did. And then she ran to her car and sped off. She was in shock and didn't report the rape immediately. She waited until the next day, but by then, due to her rinsing herself off with water, swimming to shore, and I don't know if she showered at home. I mean, I would feel that you would want to after that, but because of this, no physical evidence could be collected. But Judy was able to provide a clear description of her attacker. He was 37 to 40 years old. He was 5'9" or 5'10". He was 200 pounds and stocky with a pot belly. He had short reddish blonde hair, a light mustache. He had, acne marks on his face and a dark leathery complexion. He wore a mint green short sleeve shirt with mesh on the bottom half, and he smoked Marlboros. His vehicle was a dark blue newer model 4-door Isuzu Trooper with tinted windows, and his boat, which she thought was close to 20 feet long, had a blue canopy top and exterior, white interior, and the word Volvo painted in yellow on the engine compartment. She also recalled the man cutting gray tape and having an assortment of ropes with the life preservers. Upon hearing these details, Detective Jim was like, this all sounds too familiar to the Rogers women's murders. They found there was no boat registration in Florida for a Dave Posner or any other similar name. There was no Isuzu car in that name, no record of a Dave Posner. A couple sketches were composed of this guy, but despite hundreds of tips, they were no closer to finding this guy. As discouraging as this was, they finally decided, okay, let's go back to the evidence found in the car. The forensic team found that Dave, or this stranger's writing on the brochure, was very unique. His letter T's were capitalized in the middle of words, and his letter Y's were written with a different tail each time. They decided to then display the handwriting on 5 billboards around Tampa with a note saying, "Who wrote these directions? You may know who killed the Rogers family. $25,000 reward." Finally, this worked. On March 25th, 1992, a woman named Joanne Steffi called and said she knew who that handwriting belonged to, an aluminum contractor that had worked for her in the past. His name was Oba Chandler, and she gave the police the receipt for the job he had done for her. The handwriting matched. The forensic examiner determined it had to have been written by the same person. There was no doubt about it. In the meanwhile, the police were tracking Oba's every move, with 40 to 50 officers on the case at any moment. Oba Chandler was arrested on September 24th, 1992, as he was driving back into Florida, 3 years after Joan, Michelle, and Christy were killed. When he was questioned, he denied any ties to the Rogers murders and he refused to talk further. But police tracked down his call logs and calls to his wife, Deborah. He would call Deborah from his boat, telling her that he was going to be late home. Something, happened to his boat. The engine died. All excuses, because records proved that he was on his boat at the exact time of both Judy's rape and the Rogers murders. Judy Blair was then brought in to look at photos, hoping she would identify Oba as her rapist. It had been over 3 years since her attack. She was now 27 years old. She was married, but she still remembered every single detail. The description of his boat, the mint green cotton, mesh shirt that he wore. And when she was shown the photos, she immediately recognized Oba. Police then tried to search for Oba's boat, but surprise, surprise, he had sold it. This only made it look worse for him, so then they looked for his fingerprints on Joan's brochure, the one that they had found in her car. The partial palm print found matched Oba perfectly. They also did eventually find the boat, and they found it matched Judy's description along with his mint mesh green shirt, which he still had in his wardrobe. It took 2 years to go to trial, and in September 1994 it began. While Oba admitted to giving Joan directions, he claimed he never saw them after that and only recognized them from the media reports about their bodies being found in Tampa Bay. The night the murders took place, yeah, he was on his boat. Records prove that, but he was alone. He really did have engine troubles, and that's why he called his wife. He said he even tried to get help from the Coast Guards, but they were way too busy in the late night, by the way. and he managed to fix his engine with duct tape. But no calls were ever logged with the Coast Guard, so this was all proven to be a lie. And also, long story short, you can't fix the engine with duct tape. And an expert ended up debunking his explanation, saying that any type of tape around gasoline doesn't work. The fuel ends up dissolving the tape. So Oba was just lying his ass off. Judy Blair also testified against him and said how similar her experience was to the Rogers women. He approached tourists. He would approach tourists. He invited them onto his boat for an unforgettable experience. He used duct tape on the Rogers women and threatened Judy with the exact same thing. Scarily though, if Barbara had joined Judy on the boat, perhaps both women wouldn't have lived to tell the tale. Oba, meanwhile, stated exactly what we said before, that the sex with Judy was consensual and she just changed her mind halfway. So then that wasn't consensual, right? If she changed her mind halfway, she stopped consenting. And then how can it be consensual when you threatened her, you dickhead? Then to top it all off, Oba confessed to one of his adult children, Crystal, that he had raped a woman and killed 3 others, and they were in Tampa Bay. He was too afraid to come back to Tampa because police were on the hunt. On September 29th, 1994, Oba Chandler was found guilty of the murders of Joan, Michelle, and Christy. On September 30th, 1994, the jury recommended death for each murder by a vote of 12-0. The court agreed, and Oba was sentenced to death on November 4th, 1994. Oba maintained his innocence the entire time and appealed his sentence a lot. After 17 years on death row, on November 17th, 2011, Oba Chandler was put to death by lethal injection at the age of 65 years old. Justice was served for Joan, Michelle, Christy, and Judy, but the pain remained. Hal has said that the time has not healed the wounds left. He no longer runs a dairy farm and instead raises hogs and grows corn on his farm these days. He remarried in 2009 to a woman named Jolene. He was tired of being alone, so he put an ad in the paper, and that's how he met Jolene. And she also was a widow, but he said he still misses his girls. And how can Jolene compete with a dead person? I mean, it's never really, detailed how Joan, Christy, Michelle really died, but the evidence and Judy's testimony paints a picture. Once the 3 women got onto his boat at around 8:39 p.m., he probably entertained them and did the usual before turning on them. He most likely sexually assaulted all 3 women. Girls. I mean, Michelle and Christy were still girls. He then bound their hands and feet with the yellow nylon rope. He put duct tape on their mouths. Only on their mouths. Why? Maybe because he wanted them to see exactly what he would do next. He grabbed 3 big concrete slabs, one for each of them. He then proceeded to tie the same rope around each slab before tying a noose at the other end. He would have grabbed one of the women, put the noose around, her neck, pulled it tight, and then while she was still alive, pushed her, and then pushed the concrete slab into the water, forcing the remaining women on the boat to watch what was happening to her, their sister or mother or daughter, alive, struggling in the water, about to die. He wanted them to see, to inflict as much pain as he possibly could. He then proceeded to do the exact same thing to the other 2 women. I cannot imagine the terror they faced, their thoughts. It was the end of their vacation. They had had so much fun. They were about to head home, and this is what's happening. They're going to die. They must have thought about Hal, what he was going to feel, how he was going to deal with all of this. But sadly, as if this case, isn't sad enough, Oba possibly had many more victims. But he never took any responsibility for his crimes. He never showed any remorse. In fact, he taunted them. There is so much more to talk about, but I wanted to focus this video solely on the Rogers family. So stay tuned for next week's video where we're going to delve deeper into Oba's life and crimes. Not that he, deserves the attention, but this guy was such a son of a bitch. He was just a dickhead, rude and obnoxious, and said some of the most vile things. Thanks for watching, guys, and see you in next week's video and in the comments. So don't forget to like and subscribe. Love you guys. Besitos. Bye.